This episode is sponsored by Squarespace. Whether you need a domain, website, or online store, make your next move with Squarespace.
The other day, I had someone on Instagram send me a message and say, how do you get your images to be so sharp and clear? And I had this weird moment. It was almost like a flashback where I remember 20 years ago messaging another photographer asking exactly the same question. How do you get your images so sharp? Back then, when I compared my own images to those photographers that I really respected and followed, I just found that my images in comparison just felt a bit soft or muddy or fuzzy. I hadn't yet learned how to build that crispness and that clarity and that sharpness into my own work. Even now, if I go back and look at my early images and compare them to the images I take today, I can see a big difference. And it's clear that in the intervening years, I obviously picked up some tricks so that now I'm able to produce images that have that sharp and clean look to them if I choose. Now, of course, having sharp images isn't everything. And in fact, there's an argument to be made for having less clarity in some of our images if that's the look that we're going for. But we don't want the reason that our images aren't sharp and clear to be because we don't actually have the control to produce that sort of image if we choose to. So I thought I'd make this video to share with you what I've learned over the last 20 years about how to make images that have real clarity to them, in the hopes that you'll pick up some skills and maybe it will improve your own photography too. Let's start by talking about settings. So let's look at the best settings for you to have if having sharp, clean images out of your camera is important to you. So we just got ISO, shutter speed, aperture. ISO is easy. Just have it as low as possible, right? Because having a low ISO just means you're not going to have any noise or grain in your image. It means you're going to have the cleanest image possible. The more noise you have, the less edge clarity you're going to have on the details within your image. Then you need to pay special attention to your shutter speed and just make sure that it's fast enough, forgive my horrendous writing, for your focal length. Okay? Now there's a rule that you need to think about here, especially if you're hand holding your camera. Okay, if you're hand holding it and your shutter speed starts to slow way down and you're hand holding, it means you're going to be moving slightly, which means your image is going to get softer and eventually come up blurry because of that motion shake. There's a rule that you need to follow, and the rule is this: always make sure that your shutter speed is 1 over your focal length or faster, right? So let's give an example. So if I'm shooting on a 50mm, right, I need to make sure that my shutter speed is 1 over 50 or faster than that, right? So that I can handle. So 1 over 100, 1 over 250, whatever. It needs to be faster than 1 over 50. If I'm shooting on a 100mm, I need to make sure that my shutter speed is 1 over 100 or faster, okay? And that's going to mean that when I'm hand holding the shot, that my shutter speed is going to be fast enough to take out the shake from the focal length that I'm using. And yes, cameras these days have very clever IBIS and image stabilization in them, but I still use this rule just to play it safe. And those of you who are on APS-C might ask, well, is this about the actual focal length of the lens or the focal length equivalent? And when I was shooting on Fuji's, for example, on the APS-C, I still used to use focal length equivalent because that even gave me a little bit more breathing room in terms of making sure that my images were sharp and I was getting no camera shake. So 1 over your focal length or faster for your shutter speed. When it comes to aperture, we just need to find the lens sweet spot. Every lens has a sweet spot, right? Every lens doesn't necessarily have the same sharpness throughout the lens range. You usually find if you open up the aperture wide to say f1.4, you get lovely bokeh and fall off, but the edges are a bit soft and the clarity isn't quite as good. But as you close that aperture down, and by the way, your sweet spot will usually, on most lenses, and you'll find this as you look, it's usually around the middle of the focal length range, which will often be f8. So pay attention to that f8, okay? So you need to find that lens sweet spot. As you go further up the lens range to f11, f16, you start to get different kind of issues entering. So both ends of that range, f1.4 or f16 have problems, but if you use f8 right in the middle, that will be the sharpest your lens can get. I made this mistake early on. Back when I was starting out in street photography, the first camera I bought for street photography only was the first Fujifilm X100, and that was a 23mm lens with a maximum aperture of f2. And I just used to leave that lens open at f2 because I thought f2 is the sexy end, you know, the widest possible aperture. That's the best the lens can give you. But I was walking around at a 35mm equivalent on an APS-C sensor, wide open at f2. People were far enough away from me that I was never getting a shallow depth of field out of my shots, in which case, why was I using f2, especially when f2 is not the sharpest the lens could give me? And it took me a while to work out, close it down. If I don't need a shallow depth of field, or I'm not shooting in low light, so I have to open that aperture wide up, then why not use the sweet spot of the lens, the sharpest part of the lens? So after a while I worked out, if I put it at f8, my images are going to come out sharper all the time. So you're using these three things: ISO as low as possible, making sure your shutter speed is fast enough, using that 1 over your focal length rule or faster, and then finding the sweet spot of your lens. And that is the sharpest image that you're going to get out of your camera. The things you need to remember, the trade-offs, are this is going to be noise and low light. So you need to think about how you're going to compensate with low light there with your ISO. This is going to affect how movement appears. So obviously when you speed up your shutter speed, movement is going to be frozen rather than blurred. If you want blurred movement in your image from subjects, but you still want sharpness around the subjects, you're going to have to lock it off on a tripod or something else. And when you change your aperture, you're going to be affecting your depth of field and how deep the sharp area is in your image. So compensating for that low light and noise and the movement, the depth of field, I would always say ISO as low as you can get away with, shutter speed 1 over your focal length or faster, and find the sweet spot of your lens. That will give you the sharpest image your camera can give. Then all that's left for you to do is to nail your focus, right? Really paying attention. What do you want to be in focus in the frame? And that doesn't just mean your subject, right? That's just the one element that you want people to look at. But how much of your frame do you want to be in focus? Do you want the background in focus as well? Do you want it slightly out? Nailing your focus. And of course, some people will prefer to use manual focus. Some people will prefer to use autofocus. And of course, there's lots of modes you can use all along that spectrum in most cameras. But this is the kind of thing you need to look at if you really want that sharp image out of your camera. These are the things you need to take into consideration. So that's the technical side of things in the camera and those settings that will help you to get sharper images. But I have a theory that when people look at other people's images and they envy the clarity they're getting, I don't think they're actually seeing sharpness. I think we've used that word wrong. I think often what we're seeing that we really want to see in our own work is more contrast, and especially micro contrast. Don't worry, I will give you some practical tips in a minute for editing your images in Lightroom and adding sharpening, because I still think that's a useful skill to have. But first, I want to challenge you to stop and think for a minute. If you go and you look at the images from those photographers where you feel like their work has that crisp, clean clarity that you want to see in your own images, is it really sharpness that they have that you feel like you're missing? Is that the right word? Or is it something else they have that you're actually after? I want to save you from the mistake I made early on, where I just thought that if I brought my image into Lightroom and it looked a bit soft, I just had to ride the sharpening slider and the contrast slider and even the dreaded clarity slider, and that would bring my images back and make them look as crisp as everybody else's. But all I ended up doing was over-editing my images until one day I realized there was something else missing, something far more fundamental, and it was a good use of light. You can try this at home. Take any object and set it on a table to be photographed, and then light it with some artificial light source. If you have constant lights, use them. If not, just use a lamp. Start by lighting the object from the front and take an image. Then, for comparison's sake, put the light at 45 degrees from the object and take the image again. Then try again with the light at 90 degrees off to the side. You'll notice when you take a look at these images that the image which was lit front on just lacks that fine edge contrast in the details. But as soon as the light moves around to the side, those edges and the fine details really start to become more defined and three-dimensional. Now ask yourself, is it really sharpness you're after? Or is it actually a better use of light which your images need? Let's apply this to street photography for a second. So many of us as photographers, when we're out on the street, we're hyper-focused on finding interesting subjects or scenes, and that's a good focus to have, but maybe we're not as aware of what the light is doing to that subject or that scene. We might find an interesting space and say this is a good composition, we might tweak it a bit and take the image, but if the light is coming from directly behind us, then the image is going to look flat. The details are going to be slightly washed out in the scene because everything is lit front on. We're going to lose that clarity and those crisp edges. But what if we worked the scene a little bit more? What if we moved around to 45 degrees, to 90 degrees, or even right round and backlit that scene or that subject? We would find that we're starting to get more edge contrast, more shape, more crispness, more clarity to our shots. The same applies to portrait photography. I see so many beginner photographers doing this. If you give them two lights, they will just put one on either side of the subject and set them close to the same power to make the image. But the problem with that is that you fill in all the shadows, kill all the contrast and shape, and effectively flatten the face out. Then they wonder why their portraits don't have any pop or depth to them. I want shape, depth, and micro contrast to the portraits I make, and I don't get it from the sharpening, contrast, or clarity sliders. I get it from positioning my lighting well. Take a look at Rembrandt's use of a single light off to the side in his portraits if you want a masterclass for creating that depth, shape, and micro contrast in your portraits. I would hazard a guess that if you have more awareness about the light in your scene and learn how to use that light more effectively to shape what we're looking at, your images will immediately have more depth to them, more micro contrast to the edges, and that will appear like sharpness to your eye. And you won't need to go into Lightroom afterwards and start playing with sharpening sliders or contrast sliders or even the clarity slider to try bring back those details in post. But I did promise you that I'd give you some tips on how to sharpen in Lightroom because it's definitely useful sometimes. So let's jump in. So I'm just going to show you on my phone because almost all my street photography images are edited on my phone, and I like to take no more than 30 seconds per image. I like to keep it really simple. And this is just a shot I took recently of two boys who've just been fishing and they're having a chat down in Whitby. And I'll show you why I usually don't do any sharpening to my images at all, because if you zoom in, I just find these Sony files are very, very sharp, and I don't really want any more sharpness than that. It's enough for me. But say I did want to get a bit more sharpness in it, or I might be using a different camera or a different lens that was a bit more experimental, or I just misfocused very slightly and wanted to sharpen it back up. So let me do the very basic edit I'd normally do. So in this case, I'd probably jump over to curves, and this is just to get sort of the contrast and color where I want it to be before I start finishing off sharpening, because sharpening is probably the last thing you want to do. So that's my curves and exposure. I'd probably come across to color mix. I would lighten up the blues of the sky and desaturate slightly, and then probably take my yellows and dial them towards my oranges. I've got whole videos on how I actually edit color like this. You can go and see the theory there. And then once I got that balance right, I would probably warm up the global temperature a little bit, something like that perhaps. Maybe I'd increase the vibrancy and just take down the saturation. And I might come back over and just darken down my shadows slider and maybe the black slider as well, something like that. So there we go. So I've got the image kind of where I want it to be in terms of color. So now let's look at how you'd actually sharpen your image in Lightroom. So let's go to Edit, come across to Details, and you can see we've got 4 sliders here: Sharpening, Radius, Detail, and Masking. Sharpening is obvious. If we dial it up, it's going to sharpen more. If we dial it down, it's going to sharpen less, right? Radius is talking about how much it's going to sharpen in terms of the amount of pixels, right? So at the moment it's set to 1. So that means if it finds a hard edge it thinks needs sharpening, it will sharpen it by 1 pixel. If I dial it up, it's going to sharpen it to 2.5 pixels or 3 pixels, right? So you probably want to leave that at 1. The third slider down is Detail. Detail is telling the software what it wants you to look for, how much detail it wants you to look for before it starts to sharpen. So 25, it might look at the grouting between the bricks, but it would ignore the brick face itself. But if I dial it up to something like 80, for example, it might also look at the grain in the bricks and try sharpen everything all together. I also leave that third slider where it is at 25, right? Because there's a much more powerful way to tell Lightroom exactly what you want it to sharpen, and that's this fourth slider, Masking. So what you want to do is hold your thumb on the image and with your finger dial the mask. Can you see that? It's dialing out the white areas are where it's going to sharp, the black it's going to ignore, and I dial it almost right the way up. So now it's just sharpening the very fine edges of the grouting on the bricks, but not the bricks themselves. And you can see why this is powerful, right? We've all been in that situation where we've taken a photograph of grass in a field, we dial up the sharpening or the clarity or something, and it sharpens every blade and it just looks horrible and jagged and very digital looking. Like, we don't want that. We just want it focusing on those fine edges. And now if I dial up that sharpening, it's only being applied to the very finest edges that I've defined with that mask. You can do exactly the same thing on your PC as well. All you need to do is hold Alt when you're dialing that masking slider and it will show you the same mask, so you can define exactly where you want it to be sharpened in terms of your overall image. So once you've got your image sharpened the way that you like it, you're happy with it, you now need to think about how you're going to export this image. Because if we load an image like this, if we just export it as full res and we put it up onto something like Instagram, Instagram will compress it. And unfortunately, Instagram is pretty lazy about the way that it compresses images, and you lose some of that sharpness and it might create artifacting. So it's always better to think about where you want this image to go and export it around the size you want it to be, so the compression gets done by Lightroom rather than Instagram. So if we come up to the top, this middle icon to share, and instead of going save copy to device and then uploading, let's do export as, and then we're going to come across here, we've got JPEG. Right, normally it's going to be set to the largest available dimensions. That's great if you want to download it, you want to print it, you want to do something with it. But if you want it for social media, select the second one down, small, at 2000 pixels, right? You could even look up exactly how many pixels Instagram is going to load it at on that long side, and you could set it to exactly that pixel dimension with custom, but I just usually use 2000 pixels because then the compression is going to be way less. I leave the image quality at 100. And then the only other thing to check out is come down to more options, and then instead, this will normally be set to none. This is what the screen will look like. File naming, original fine, output sharpening. Use this drop down where it says none. Come down here to screen because it's going to sharpen it. And look at the other options. It's got matte paper, glossy paper for print. We're telling it to sharpen it for screens because people will be looking at this image on a phone through Instagram or maybe on a computer screen, right? Leave the amount to standard and leave the color space. And then when you export that image, JPEG, you've downsized it in terms of the dimension, and in that more options, you've told it the output sharpening is for screen, then you can export that and it will give you an image that will hopefully hold up and still look sharp wherever you happen to post it online. So I hope this video has helped and got you thinking about the sort of settings you can be using in your camera that will give you the cleanest, sharpest images. The post-processing you can be doing after the fact, which will just help tighten things up a bit and crispen the edges. Although I would always warn you that less is always more when it comes to editing. You don't want to be over-editing your shots because that will distract us from what you're trying to show us in the image. But most of all, I hope you take away that use of light and how if you think about lighting better, that will help to shape things and give you that micro contrast and the detail that you want in your shots. And that maybe this whole time, this quest for sharpness has actually been a quest for clarity in the camera. And the only way to get that is by using light really well. And maybe it's just worth mentioning at this point that perhaps you don't want sharp images. I mean, that might seem a silly thing to say to some of you, but think about it. So many photographers these days are actively trying to soften their images in lots of different ways to harken back to what film used to look and feel like to us. And there's nothing wrong with that either. For example, I often dial down the sharpening slider slightly in Lightroom, especially for the files that come out of my Sonys, because I find they're often razor sharp already, and I want to back it off a little bit because it can feel too digital. And I'll often shoot with a filter in front of the lens, something like a 1/4 Pro Mist, just to soften those edges slightly again, because I like the feel that that gives me. So you have to ask yourself, is sharpness really what you're after in your images? But the principles still remain, and they're still good skills to have to work out how to nail your focus, where the sweet spot is in your lens, at what aperture does it sit, how to use your shutter speed correctly, and then how to use light well so that you can, if you want to, get those images that have that crisp clarity to them. If you want to be a competent photographer, it's a tool you probably need to have in your toolbox, and especially if you want to do work for other people one day, this is a feature of your photography and an ability that you have that your clients will love and appreciate. I wish you the best of luck. Just before I go, if you want a way to support this channel and help me out, the best way you can do that is by picking up a copy of my Parable magazine. There are now 6 editions available. Each one features writing and photography around a theme. And I love putting these together. I get to talk about some aspect of photography, but then move through by the end to talk a little bit about some kind of life philosophy or something I feel will be hopeful for you. Each edition is available in 2 formats. One, like this, in physical format, is A4 size, printed on beautiful uncoated matte paper, and the other is a digital version, which is a download that features a PDF file of the magazine and an MP3 file of me reading the magazine to you. I'll leave links down below so you can go and pick up a copy. And then lastly, I want to say thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this episode. If you need a new website or a domain, they're a fantastic option. I've used them myself as my website of choice for over a decade now. When I started my photography website years ago, the biggest thing I wanted was control. I didn't want to have to contact a web designer every time I wanted to make a change, but I'm a web idiot. I have no idea about coding, so I needed something that looked great but was super simple to use. With Squarespace, it was so intuitive to use. I could just set up my pages and drag on text blocks and image blocks and galleries and videos and contact forms, and even set myself up a store, and I could make changes on the fly at any time. I could change fonts or colors or some of the design elements or reorder the navigation. Whatever I wanted to do was literally just a few clicks, and I could even toggle on and off the desktop view and the mobile view so I could see what different customers or people who visited my website would be seeing. It couldn't be simpler.
Start your free trial today at squarespace.com and go to squarespace.com/Sean Tucker to get 10% off your first purchase.